Naptown Tuner here, like and subscribe. Today I'm going to be talking about the circuit range performance fault. This type of malfunction does not seem to be possible under normal operating conditions. That's why it's setting the fault. You could have a circuit range performance fault for all kinds of stuff. Or sometimes it's just called range performance malfunction of some kind. And it could be for an oil pressure switch. It could be for a throttle position sensor. It could be for this example right here. What I've got is an intake flap changeover in the intake manifold. And it's going to be sending the signal with this sensor right here. But this sensor right here, it's just a dummy. It's just a sensor. This sensor is just sending voltage and receiving voltage based on where these flaps actually are. So I'm not really going to be talking about the purpose of these flaps, but really it's just more efficient for the power range. At an idle, you get a little bit better fuel economy with a smaller hole, and then when you're up to higher RPM, you make these holes bigger, and then you benefit more from your fuel economy and for your power and all this kind of thing. So that's what these changeover flaps are meant to do. But it's not, like I said, it's not always this sensor when you have a range performance fault. A range performance fault basically means the ECU is not stupid, the engine control unit. It knows where certain parameters should be because it knows other things. It knows a lot of things. Basically, it knows, like, for instance, the camshaft and crankshaft speeds. It knows the engine speed. It knows how much air is going to the engine because the engine has a MAP sensor, manifold absolute pressure sensor, a mass airflow sensor, MAF sensor. So sometimes they have both of them. It has a boost sensor, like electronic boost controller in the newer cars. There's all kinds of fancy controls. And if one of them is out of parameters, it might set that fault because it doesn't make logical sense to the engine control unit that this parameter is way out of where it should be. So for instance, if these flaps should be open at, let's say, 3,200 RPM, it knows that at 3,200 RPM, I can't remember if that's the exact value, but it knows that at that RPM, it should be sending a signal to this first. And this little solenoid valve should supply vacuum, so you have to rely on this first. This has to allow vacuum to go into this diaphragm. So then you have to make sure that this nipple and this hose is good. And then we have to make sure that this diaphragm is good. And then we have to make sure that this linkage is good. And then we have to make sure that this hinge is good. And then we may have to make sure that all of this linkage is good. And then by the time we get down here to the sensor, it needs to be operating exactly like the ECU thinks it should, because buddy, at 3,200 RPM and plus, these flaps are supposed to be open. So if these flaps are not open, then this sensor is not sending the correct voltage back to the ECU to tell it that it's operating properly. So this sensor is not what's making it operate. What's making it operate is other things that ultimately send the trigger off from this first. So the range performance is kind of self-explanatory. It's out of its range. It's not performing correctly. Some people would just instantly be like, well, sensor's bad. Well, it could be. The sensor could have an internal short or failure. There's a little plastic piece inside the sensor. It could be rounded off or broken, or but it could be wiring. It could be that the wiring is just a little bit chewed up by a rodent and the voltage is just a little bit wrong. So it's not sending the correct voltage back to the ECU. So you really have to make sure that everything is operating in the system before you just throw parts at stuff. This is just a 2-pin connector. There's no feedback loop on this solenoid. This is a mechanical unit right here. There's no feedback loop on this mechanical unit. This right here is a mechanical unit right here with the shaft that goes all the way through. The only feedback that we're getting is this sensor. That is the feedback loop to make sure that everything is where it's supposed to be. That's where you would get your range performance fault. Let's say you have no signal / communication. You probably forgot to plug it back in. Let's say you have an implausible signal. That's probably leaning more towards the electrical issue or the sensor itself, so on and so forth.